Tonight you are exactly where you need to be. You've found your way to a quiet little corner of the night, where the world slows down, the stars begin to whisper, and soft stories drift like moonlight through the dark. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's story, I just want to gently ask, if you find comfort in these bedtime moments, it would mean the world if you'd take a second to like this video, subscribe, or even share it with someone else who could use a little peace. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing night after night. Now settle in, let the day melt away, and let's begin. Once upon a time there lived in a small cottage among some hills a woman with her son, and, to her great grief, the young man, though hardly more than 20 years of age, had not as much hair on his head as a baby. But old as he looked, the youth was very idle, and whatever trade his mother put him to, he refused to work, and in a few days always came home again. On a fine summer morning he was lying as usual, half asleep in the little garden in front of the cottage when the Sultan's daughter came riding by, followed by a number of gaily dressed ladies. The youth lazily raised himself on his elbow to look at her, and that one glance changed his whole nature. "I will marry her and nobody else," he thought. And jumping up, he went to find his mother. "You must go at once to the Sultan and tell him that I want his daughter for my wife," he said. "What?" shouted the old woman, shrinking back into a corner, for nothing but sudden madness could explain such an amazing errand. "Don't you understand? You must go at once to the Sultan and tell him that I want his daughter for my wife," repeated the youth impatiently. But do you know what you are saying?" stammered the mother. "You will learn no trade, and have only the 5 gold pieces left you by your father. And can you really expect that the Sultan would give his daughter to a penniless bald pate like you? That is my affair. Do as I bid you." And neither day nor night did her son cease tormenting her till, in despair, she put on her best clothes and wrapped her veil about her and went over the hill to the palace. It was the day that the Sultan set apart for hearing the complaints and petitions of his people, so the woman found no difficulty in gaining admission to his presence. "Do not think me mad, O Excellency," she began, "though I know I must seem like it. But I have a son who, since his eyes have rested on the veiled face of the princess, has not left me in peace day or night till I consented to come to the palace, and to ask your Excellency for your daughter's hand. It was in vain I answered that my head might pay the forfeit of my boldness. He would listen to nothing. Therefore am I here. Do with me even as you will." Now the Sultan always loved anything out of the common, and this situation was new indeed. So instead of ordering the trembling creature to be flogged or cast into prison, as some other sovereigns might have done, he merely said, "Bid your son come hither." The old woman stared in astonishment at such a reply, but when the Sultan repeated his words even more gently than before, and did not look in any wise angered, she took courage, and bowing again she hastened homeward. "Well, how have you sped?" asked her son eagerly as she crossed the threshold. "You are to go up to the palace without delay and speak to the Sultan himself," replied the mother. And when he heard the good news, his face lightened up so wonderfully that his mother thought what a pity it was that he had no hair, as then he would be quite handsome. "Ah, the lightning will not fly more swiftly," cried he, and in another instant he was out of her sight. When the Sultan beheld the bald head of his daughter's wooer, he no longer felt in the mood for joking, and resolved that he must somehow or other shake himself free of such an unwelcome lover. But as he had summoned the young man to the palace, he could hardly dismiss him without a reason, so he hastily said, "I hear you wish to marry my daughter? Well and good. But the man who is to be her husband must first collect all the birds in the world, and bring them into the gardens of the palace, for hitherto no birds have made their homes in the trees." The young man was filled with despair at the Sultan's words. How was he to snare all these birds? And even if he did succeed in catching them, it would take years to carry them to the palace. Still, he was too proud to let the Sultan think that he had given up the princess without a struggle. So he took a road that led past the palace and walked on, not noticing whither he went. In this manner a week slipped by, and at length he found himself crossing a desert with great rocks scattered here and there. In the shadow cast by one of these was seated a holy man, or dervish, as he was called, who motioned to the youth to sit beside him. "Something is troubling you, my son," said the holy man. "Tell me what it is, as I may be able to help you." "Oh, my father," answered the youth, "I wish to marry the princess of my country, but the Sultan refuses to give her to me unless I can collect all the birds in the world and bring them into his garden. And how can I or any other man do that?" "Do not despair," replied the dervish. "It is not so difficult as it sounds. 2 days' journey from here, in the path of the setting sun, there stands a cypress tree, larger than any other cypress that grows upon the earth. Sit down where the shadow is darkest, close to the trunk, and keep very still. By and by you will hear a mighty rushing of wings, and all the birds in the world will come and nestle in the branches. Be careful not to make a sound till everything is quiet again, and then say, 'Madshun.' At that, the birds will be forced to remain where they are. Not one can move from its perch, and you will be able to place them all over your head and arms and body, and in this way you must carry them to the Sultan." With a glad heart, the young man thanked the dervish, and paid such close heed to his directions that, a few days later, a strange figure covered with soft feathers walked into the presence of the Sultan. The princess's father was filled with surprise, for never had he seen such a sight before. Oh, how lovely were those little bodies and bright frightened eyes. Soon a gentle stirring was heard, and what a multitude of wings unfolded themselves, blue wings, yellow wings, red wings, green wings. And when the young man whispered, "Go," they first flew in circles round the Sultan's head, and then disappeared through the open window to choose homes in the garden. "I have done your bidding, O Sultan, and now give me the princess," said the youth. And the Sultan answered hurriedly, "Yes, oh yes, you have pleased me well. Only one thing remains to turn you into a husband that any girl might desire. That head of yours, you know, it is so very bald. Get it covered with nice thick curly hair, and then I will give you my daughter. You are so clever that I am sure this will give you no trouble at all." Silently the young man listened to the Sultan's words, and silently he sat in his mother's kitchen for many days to come, till one morning the news reached him that the Sultan had betrothed his daughter to the son of the Wazir, and that the wedding was to be celebrated without delay in the palace. With that he arose in wrath, and made his way quickly and secretly to a side door, used only by the workmen who kept the building in repair, and, unseen by anyone, he made his way into the mosque, and then entered the palace by a gallery which opened straight into the great hall. Here the bride and bridegroom and 2 or 3 friends were assembled, waiting for the appearance of the Sultan for the contract to be signed. "Madshun," whispered the youth from above, and instantly everyone remained rooted to the ground, and some messengers whom the Sultan had sent to see that all was ready shared the same fate. At length, angry and impatient, the Sultan went down to behold with his own eyes what had happened, but as nobody could give him any explanation, he bade one of his attendants to fetch a magician, who dwelt near one of the city gates, to remove the spell which had been cast by some evil genius. "It is your own fault," said the magician when he had heard the Sultan's story. "If you had not broken your promise to the young man, your daughter would not have had this ill befall her. Now there is only one remedy, and the bridegroom you have chosen must yield his place to the bald-headed youth." Sore though he was in his heart, the Sultan knew that the magician was wiser than he, and dispatched his most trusted servants to seek out the young man without a moment's delay and bring him to the palace. The youth, who all this time had been hiding behind a pillar, smiled to himself when he heard these words, and hastening home he said to his mother, "If messengers from the Sultan should come here and ask for me, be sure you answer that it is a long while since I went away, and that you cannot tell where I may be, but that if they will give you money enough for your journey, as you are very poor, you will do your best to find me." Then he hid himself in the loft above, so that he could listen to all that passed. The next minute someone knocked loudly at the door, and the old woman jumped up and opened it. "Is your bald-headed son here?" asked the man outside. "If so, let him come with me, as the Sultan wishes to speak with him directly." "Alas, sir," replied the woman, putting a corner of her veil to her eyes. "He left me long since, and since that day no news of him has reached me." "Oh, good lady, can you not guess where he may be? The Sultan intends to bestow on him the hand of his daughter, and he is certain to give a large reward to the man who brings him back." "He never told me whither he was going," answered the crone, shaking her head. "But it is a great honor that the Sultan does him, and well worth some trouble. There are places where perhaps he may be found, but they are known to me only, and I am a poor woman and have no money for the journey." "Oh, that will not stand in the way," cried the man. "In this purse are 1,000 gold pieces. Spend them freely. Tell me where I can find him, and you shall have as many more." "Very well," said she. "It is a bargain. And now farewell, for I must make some preparations, but in a few days at furthest you shall hear from me." For nearly a week both the old woman and her son were careful not to leave the house till it was dark, lest they should be seen by any of the neighbors, and as they did not even kindle a fire or light a lantern, everyone supposed that the cottage was deserted. At length, one fine morning, the young man got up early and dressed himself, and put on his best turban, and after a hasty breakfast took the road to the palace. The huge negro before the door evidently expected him, for without a word he let him pass, and another attendant who was waiting inside conducted him straight into the presence of the Sultan, who welcomed him gladly. "Ah, my son, where have you hidden yourself all this time?" said he. And the bald-headed man answered, "O Sultan, fairly I won your daughter, but you broke your word and would not give her to me. Then my home grew hateful to me, and I set out to wander through the world. But now that you have repented of your ill faith, I have come to claim the wife who is mine of right. Therefore bid your wazir prepare the contract." So a fresh contract was prepared, and at the wish of the new bridegroom was signed by the Sultan and the wazir in the chamber where they met. After this was done, the youth begged the Sultan to lead him to the princess, and together they entered the big hall, where everyone was standing exactly as they were when the young man had uttered the fatal word. "Can you remove the spell?" asked the Sultan anxiously. "I think so," replied the young man, who, to say the truth, was a little anxious himself, and stepping forward he cried, "Let the victims of Madshun be free." No sooner were the words uttered than the statues returned to life, and the bride placed her hand joyfully in that of her new bridegroom. As for the old one, he vanished completely, and no one ever knew what became of him. In a part of Arabia where groves of palms and sweet-scented flowers give the traveler rest after toilsome journeys under burning skies, there reigned a young king whose name was Lino. He had grown up under the wise rule of his father, who had lately died, and though he was only 19, he did not believe, like many young men, that he must change all the laws in order to show how clever he was, but was content with the old ones which had made the people happy and the country prosperous. There was only one fault that his subjects had to find with him, and that was that he did not seem in any hurry to be married, in spite of the prayers that they frequently offered him. The neighboring kingdom was governed by the Swan Fairy, who had an only daughter, the Princess Hermosa, who was as charming in her way as Lino in his. The Swan Fairy always had an ambassador at the young king's court, and on hearing the grumbles of the citizens that Lino showed no signs of taking a wife, the good man resolved that he would try his hand at matchmaking. "For," he said, "if there is anyone living who is worthy of the Princess Hermosa, he is to be found here. At any rate, I can but try and bring them together." Now, of course, it was not proper to offer the princess in marriage, and the difficulty was to work upon the unconscious king so as to get the proposal to come from him. But the ambassador was well used to the ways of courts, and after several conversations on the art of painting, which Lino loved, he led the talk to portraits, and mentioned carelessly that a particularly fine picture had lately been made of his own princess. "Though as for a likeness," he concluded, "perhaps it is hardly as good as this small miniature which was painted a year ago." The king took it and looked at it closely. "Ah," he sighed, "that must be flattered. It cannot be possible that any woman should be such a miracle of beauty." "If you could only see her," answered the ambassador. The king did not reply, but the ambassador was not at all surprised when, the following morning, he was sent for into the royal presence. "Since you showed me that picture," began Lino, almost before the door was shut, "I have not been able to banish the face of the princess from my thoughts. I have summoned you here to inform you that I am about to send special envoys to the court of the Swan Fairy, asking her daughter in marriage. I cannot, as you will understand, speak for my mistress in so important a matter," replied the ambassador, stroking his beard in order to conceal the satisfaction he felt. "But I know that she will certainly be highly gratified at your proposal." "If that is so," cried the king, his whole face beaming with joy, "then, instead of sending envoys, I will go myself, and take you with me. In 3 days my preparations will be made, and we will set out." Unluckily for Lino, he had for his neighbor on the other side a powerful magician named Ismenor, who was king of the Isle of Lions, and the father of a hideous daughter, whom he thought the most beautiful creature that ever existed. Riquette, for such was her name, had also fallen in love with a portrait, but it was of King Lino, and she implored her father to give him to her for a husband. Ismenor, who considered that no man lived who was worthy of his treasure, was about to send his chief minister to King Lino on this mission, when the news reached him that the king had already started for the court of the Swan Fairy. Riquette was thrown into transports of grief and implored her father to prevent the marriage, which Ismenor promised to do, and calling for an ugly and hump-backed little dwarf named Raybot, he performed some spells which transported them quickly to a rocky valley through which the king and his escort were bound to pass. When the tramp of horses was heard, the magician took out an enchanted handkerchief, which rendered invisible anyone who touched it. Giving one end to Rabot and holding the other himself, they walked unseen amongst the horsemen, but not a trace of Lino was to be found. And this was natural enough, because the king, tired out with the excitement and fatigue of the last few days, had bidden the heavy coaches, laden with presents for the princess, to go forwards while he rested under the palms with a few of his friends. Here Ismenor beheld them, all sound asleep, and casting a spell which prevented their waking till he wished them to do so, he stripped the king of all his clothes and dressed him in those of Rabot, whom he touched with his ring, saying, "Take the shape of Lino until you have wedded the daughter of the Swan Fairy." And so great was the magician's power that Rabot positively believed himself to be really the king. When the groom had mounted Lino's horse, and had ridden out of sight, Ismenor aroused the king, who stared with astonishment at the dirty garments in which he was dressed. But before he had time to look about him, the magician caught him up in a cloud and carried him off to his daughter. Meantime Rabbit had come up with the others, who never guessed for a moment that he was not their own master. "I am hungry," said he. "Give me something to eat at once." "May it please your majesty," answered the steward, "the tents are not even set up, and it will be at least an hour before your supper is served." We thought. "Who taught you to think?" interrupted the false king rudely. "You are nothing but a fool. Get me some horse's flesh directly. It is the best meat in the world." The steward could hardly believe his ears. King Lino, the most polite man under the sun, to speak to his faithful servant in such a manner, and to want horse's flesh too. Why, he was so delicate in his appetite that he lived mostly on fruit and cakes. Well, well, there was no knowing what people would come to. And anyhow, he must obey at once if he wished to keep his head on his shoulders. Perhaps, after all, it was love which had driven him mad. And if so, by and by he might come right again, whatever excuses his old servants might invent for their master. By the time the procession reached the Swan's Fairy capital, there were no more horses left, and they were forced to walk up to the palace on foot. Hiding their surprise as best they could, they begged the king to follow them, dismounting from their own horses, as he, they supposed, preferred to walk. They soon perceived the Swan Fairy and her daughter awaiting them on a low balcony, under which the king stopped. "Madam," he said, "you may be surprised that I have come to ask your daughter's hand in so unceremonious a fashion. But the journey is long, and I was hungry and ate my horse, which is the best meat in the world, and I forced my courtiers to eat theirs also. But for all that I am a great king, and wish to be your son-in-law. And now that is settled, where is Hermosa?" "Sire," answered the queen, not a little displeased as well as amazed at the king's manner, which was so different from anything she had been led to expect. "You possess my daughter's portrait, and it can have made but little impression on you if you don't recognize her at once." "I don't remember any portrait," replied Rabot, "but perhaps it may be in my pocket after all." And he searched everywhere, while the ladies in waiting looked on with astonishment, but of course found nothing. When he had finished, he turned to the princess, who stood there blushing and angry, and said, "If it is you whom I have come to marry, I think you are very beautiful, and I am sure if I had even seen your portrait I should have remembered it. Let us have the wedding as soon as possible, and meantime I should like to go to sleep, for your country is very different from mine, and I can assure you that after walking over stones and sand for days and days, one needs a little rest." And without waiting for a reply, he bade one of the pages conduct him to his room, where he was soon snoring so loud that he could be heard at the other end of the town. As soon as he was out of their sight, the poor princess flung herself into her mother's arms and burst into tears. For 15 days she had had King Lino's portrait constantly before her, while the letter from their own ambassador speaking of the young man's grace and charm had never left her pocket. True, the portrait was faithful enough, but how could that fair outside contain so rough and rude a soul? Yet this even she might have forgiven had the king shown any of the signs of love and admiration to which she had been so long accustomed. As for her mother, the poor swan fairy was so bewildered at the extraordinary manners of her new son-in-law that she was almost speechless. Matters were in this state when King Lino's chamberlain begged for a private audience of Her Majesty, and no sooner were they alone than he told her that he feared that his master had suddenly gone mad, or had fallen under the spell of some magician. "I had been lost in astonishment before," said he, "but now that he has failed to recognize the princess and no longer possesses her portrait, which he never would part from for a single instant, my amazement knows no bounds. Perhaps, madam, your fairy gifts may be able to discover the reason of this change in one whose courtesy was the talk of the kingdom." And with a low bow he took his departure. The queen stood where the chamberlain left her, thinking deeply. Suddenly her face cleared, and going to an old chest which she kept in a secret room, she drew from it a small mirror. In this mirror she could see faithfully reflected whatever she wished, and at this moment she desired above all things to behold King Lino as he really was. Ah! The chamberlain was right. It was not he who was lying on his bed snoring till the whole palace shook beneath him. No, this was her real son-in-law, the man dressed in dirty clothes and imprisoned in one of Ismenor's strongest towers, and kissing the portrait of Hermosa which had escaped the wizard's notice, owing to the young king having worn it, for better concealment, tied amongst his hair. Calling hastily to her daughter, she bade her also look, and Hermosa had the pleasure of gazing on Lino, who was behaving exactly as she could have wished. The mirror was still in her hand when the door of the prison opened, and there entered the hideous Riquette, who, from her upraised eyes, seemed to be begging from Lino some favor which he refused to grant. Of course, Hermosa and her mother could not hear their words, but from Riquette's angry face as she left the room, it was not difficult to guess what had happened. But the mirror had more to tell, for it appears that in fury at her rejection by the king, Riquette had ordered 4 strong men to scourge him till he fainted, which was done in the sight of Hermosa, who in horror dropped the mirror, and would have fallen had she not been caught by her mother. "Control yourself, my child," said the fairy. "We have need of all our wits if we are to rescue the king from the power of those wicked people. And first it is necessary to know who the man that has taken his name and his face really is." Then, picking up the mirror, she wished that she might behold the false lover, and the glass gave back a vision of a dirty, greasy groom, lying dressed as he was on her bed of state. "So this is the trick Ismenor hoped to play us. Well, we will have our revenge, whatever it costs us to get it. Only we must be very careful not to let him guess that he has not deceived us, for his skill in magic is greater than mine, and I shall have to be very prudent. To begin with, I must leave you, and if the false king asks why, then answer that I have to settle some affairs on the borders of my kingdom. Meanwhile, be sure you treat him most politely, and arrange fetes to amuse him. If he shows any sign of being suspicious, you can even give him to understand that, on your marriage, I intend to give up the crown to your husband. And now farewell." So saying, the swan fairy waved her hand, and a cloud came down and concealed her, and nobody imagined that the beautiful white cloud that was blown so rapidly across the sky was the chariot that was carrying the swan fairy to the tower of Ismenor. Now the tower was situated in the midst of a forest, so the queen thought that under cover of the dark trees it would be quite easy for her to drop to earth unseen. But the tower was so thoroughly enchanted that the more she tried to reach the ground, the tighter something tried to hold her back. At length, by putting forth all the power she possessed, she managed to descend to the foot of the tower, and there, weak and faint as she was with her exertions, she lost no time in working her spells, and found that she could only overcome Ismenor by means of a stone from the ring of Gyges. But how was she to get this ring? For the magic book told her that Ismenor guarded it night and day among his most precious treasures. However, get it she must, and in the meantime the first step was to see the royal prisoner himself. So, drawing out her tablets, she wrote as follows: "The bird which brings you this letter is the swan fairy, mother of Hermosa, who loves you as much as you love her." And after this assurance, she related the wicked plot of which he had been the victim. Then, quickly changing herself into a swallow, she began to fly round the tower, till she discovered the window of Lino's prison. It was so high up that bars seemed needless, especially as 4 soldiers were stationed in the passage outside. Therefore the fairy was able to enter, and even to hop on his shoulder. But he was so much occupied with gazing at the princess's portrait that it was some time before she could attract his attention. At last she gently scratched his cheek with the corner of the note, and he looked round with a start. On perceiving the swallow, he knew at once that help had come, and tearing open the letter, he wept with joy on seeing the words it contained, and asked 1,000 questions as to Hermosa, which the swallow was unable to answer, though by repeated nods she signed to him to read further. "Must I indeed pretend to wish to marry that horrible Riquet?" he cried when he had finished. "Can I obtain the stone from the magician?" Accordingly, the next morning, when Riquet paid him her daily visit, he received her much more graciously than usual. The magician's daughter could not contain her delight at this change, and in answer to her expressions of joy, Lino told her that he had had a dream by which he had learned the inconstancy of Hermosa, also that a fairy had appeared and informed him that if he wished to break the bonds which bound him to the faithless princess and transfer his affections to the daughter of Ismenor, he must have in his possession for a day and a night a stone from the ring of Gyges, now in the possession of the magician. This news so enchanted Riquet that she flung her arms round the king's neck and embraced him tenderly, greatly to his disgust, as he would infinitely have preferred the sticks of the soldiers. However, there was no help for it, and he did his best to seem pleased, till Riquet relieved him by announcing that she must lose no time in asking her father and obtaining from him the precious stone. His daughter's request came as a great surprise to Ismenor, whose suspicions were instantly excited. But think as he would, he could not see any means by which the king, so closely guarded, might have held communication with the swan fairy. Still, he would do nothing hastily, and hiding his dismay, he told Riquet that his only wish was to make her happy, and that as she wished so much for the stone, he would fetch it for her. Then he went into the closet where all his spells were worked, and in a short time he discovered that his enemy the swan fairy was at that moment inside his palace. "So that is it," he said, smiling grimly. "Well, she shall have a stone by all means, but a stone that will turn everyone who touches it into marble." And placing a small ruby in a box, he returned to his daughter. "Here is the talisman which will gain you the love of King Lino," he said. "But be sure you give him the box unopened, or else the stone will lose all its virtue." With a cry of joy, Riquet snatched the box from his hands and ran off to the prison, followed by her father, who, holding tightly the enchanted handkerchief, was able, unseen, to watch the working of the spell. As he expected, at the foot of the tower stood the swan fairy, who had had the imprudence to appear in her natural shape, waiting for the stone which the prince was to throw to her. Eagerly she caught the box as it fell from the prince's hands, but no sooner had her fingers touched the ruby than a curious hardening came over her. Her limbs stiffened, and her tongue could hardly utter the words, "We are betrayed." "Yes, you are betrayed," cried Ismenor in a terrible voice. "And you," he continued, dragging the king to the window, "you shall turn into a parrot, and a parrot you will remain until you can persuade Hermosa to crush in your head." He had hardly finished before a blue parrot flew out into the forest, and the magician, mounting in his winged chariot, set off for the Isle of Swans, where he changed everybody into statues, exactly in the positions in which he found them, not even excepting Rabot himself. Only Hermosa was spared, and her he ordered to get into his chariot beside him, In a few minutes he reached the Forest of Wonders, when the magician got down and dragged the unhappy princess out after him. "I have changed your mother into a stone, and your lover into a parrot," said he, "and you are to become a tree, and a tree you will remain until you have crushed the head of the person you love best in the world. But I will leave you your mind and memory, that your tortures may be increased 1,000-fold." Great magician as he was, Ismenor could not have invented a more terrible fate had he tried for 100 years. The hours passed wearily by for the poor princess, who longed for a woodcutter's axe to put an end to her misery. How were they to be delivered from their doom? And even supposing that King Lino did fly that way, there were thousands of blue parrots in the forest. And how was she to know him, or he her? As to her mother, that was too bad to think about. So being a woman, she kept on thinking. Meanwhile, the blue parrot flew about the world, making friends wherever he went, till, one day, he entered the castle of an old wizard who had just married a beautiful young wife. Grenadine, for such was her name, led a very dull life, and was delighted to have a playfellow. So she gave him a golden cage to sleep in, and delicious fruits to eat. Only in one way did he disappoint her. He never would talk as other parrots did. "If you only knew how happy it would make me, I'm sure you would try," she was fond of saying, but the parrot did not seem to hear her. One morning, however, she left the room to gather some flowers, and the parrot, finding himself alone, hopped to the table and, picking up a pencil, wrote some verses on a piece of paper. He had just finished when he was startled by a noise, and letting fall the pencil, he flew out of the window. Now hardly had he dropped the pencil when the wizard lifted a corner of the curtain which hung over the doorway and advanced into the room. Seeing a paper on the table, he picked it up, and great was his surprise as he read, "Fair princess, to win your grace, I will hold discourse with you. Silence, though, were more in place than chattering like a cockatoo." "I half suspected it was enchanted," murmured the wizard to himself, and he fetched his books and searched them, and found that instead of being a parrot, the bird was really a king who had fallen under the wrath of a magician, and that magician the man whom the wizard hated most in the world. Eagerly he read on, seeking for some means of breaking the enchantment, and at last, to his great joy, he discovered the remedy. Then he hurried to his wife, who was lying on some cushions under the tree on which the parrot had perched, and informed her that her favorite was really the king of a great country, and that if she would whistle for the bird, they would all go together to a certain spot in the Forest of Marvels, where I will restore him to his own shape. Only you must not be afraid or cry out whatever I do," added he, "or everything will be spoilt." The wizard's wife jumped up in an instant, so delighted was she, and began to whistle the song that the parrot loved. But as he did not wish it to be known that he had been listening to the conversation, he waited until she had turned her back, when he flew down the tree and alighted on her shoulder. Then they got into a golden boat, which carried them to a clearing in the forest. where 3 tall trees stood by themselves. "I want these trees for my magic fire," he said to his wife. "Put the parrot on that branch. He will be quite safe, and go yourself to a little distance. If you stay too near, you may get your head crushed in their fall." At these words, the parrot suddenly remembered the prophecy of Ismenor and held himself ready, his heart beating at the thought that in one of those trees he beheld Hermosa. Meanwhile, the magician took a spade and loosened the earth of the roots of the 3 trees, so that they might fall all together. Directly the parrot observed them totter, he spread his wings and flew right under the middle one, which was the most beautiful of the 3. There was a crash. Then Lino and Hermosa stood facing each other, clasped hand in hand. After the first few moments, the princess's thoughts turned to her mother, and falling at the feet of the magician, who was smiling with delight at the success of his plan, she implored him to help them once more, and to give the swan fairy back her proper shape. "That is not so easy," said he, "but I will try what I can do." And transporting himself to his palace to obtain a little bottle of poisoned water, he waited till nightfall, and started at once for Ismenor's tower. Of course, had Ismenor consulted his books, he would have seen what his enemy was doing. He might have protected himself, but he had been eating and drinking too much, and had gone to bed, sleeping heavily. Changing himself into a bat, the magician flew into the room, and hiding himself in the curtains, he poured all the liquid over Ismenor's face so that he died without a groan. At the same instant the swan fairy became a woman again, for no magician, however powerful, can work spells which last beyond his own life. So when the swan fairy returned to her capital, she found all her courtiers waiting at the gate to receive her, and in their midst, beaming with happiness, Hermosa and King Lino. Standing behind them, though a long way off, was Rabot, but his dirty clothes had given place to clean ones when his earnest desire was granted, and the princess had made him head of her stables. And here we must bid them all farewell, feeling sure they will have many years of happiness before them after the terrible trials through which they have passed. One day a powerful king and his beautiful wife were sitting in the gardens of their capital city, talking earnestly about the future life of their little son, who was sleeping by their side in his beautiful golden cradle. They had been married for many years without children, so when this baby came they thought themselves the happiest couple in the whole world. He was a fine, sturdy little boy, who loved to kick and to strike out with his fists. But even if he had been weak and small, they would still have thought him the most wonderful creature upon earth. And so absorbed were they in making plans for him, that they never noticed a huge dark shadow creeping up, till a horrible head with gleaming teeth stretched over them, and in an instant their beloved baby was snatched away. For a while the king and queen remained where they were, speechless with horror. Then the king rose slowly, and holding out his hand to his wife, led her weeping into the palace, and for many days their subjects saw no more of them. Meanwhile the dragon soared high into the air, holding the cradle between his teeth, and the baby still slept on. He flew so fast that he soon crossed the borders of another kingdom, and again he beheld the king and queen of the country seated in the garden with a little girl lying in a wonderful cradle of white satin and lace. Swooping down from behind as he had done before, he was just about to seize the cradle, when the king jumped up and dealt him such a blow with his golden staff that the dragon not only started back, but in his pain let fall the boy, as he spread his wings and soared into the air away from all danger. "That was a narrow escape," said the king, turning to his wife, who sat pale with fright and clasping her baby tightly in her arms. "Frightful," murmured the queen. "But look, what is that glittering object that is lying out there?" The king walked in the direction of her finger, and to his astonishment beheld another cradle and another baby. "Ah! The monster must have stolen this as he sought to steal Garlaug," cried he. And stooping lower, he read some words that were written on the fine linen that was wound round the boy. "This is Grethari, son of Grethari the king." Unfortunately, it happened that the two neighboring monarchs had had a serious quarrel, and for some years had ceased holding communication with each other. So instead of sending a messenger at once to Grethari to tell him of the safety of his son, the king contented himself with adopting the baby, which was brought up with Geirlaug the princess. For a while things went well with the children, who were as happy as the day was long. But at last there came a time when the queen could no more run races or play at hide-and-seek with them in the garden as she was so fond of doing, but lay and watched them from a pile of soft cushions. By and by she gave up doing even that, and people in the palace spoke with low voices, and even Geirlaug and Grethari trod gently and moved quietly when they drew near her room. At length, one morning, they were sent for by the king himself, who, his eyes red with weeping, told them that the queen was dead. Great was the sorrow of the two children, for they had loved the queen very dearly, and life seemed dull without her. But the lady-in-waiting who took care of them in the tower which had been built for them while they were still babies was kind and good, and when the king was busy or away in other parts of his kingdom, she made them quite happy, and saw that they were taught everything that a prince and princess ought to know. Thus 2 or 3 years passed, when one day, as the children were anxiously awaiting their father's return from a distant city, there rode post-haste into the courtyard of the palace a herald whom the king had sent before him, to say that he was bringing back a new wife, now comma in itself. There was nothing very strange or dreadful in the fact that the king should marry again, but, as the old lady-in-waiting soon guessed, the queen, in spite of her beauty, was a witch, and as it was easy to see that she was jealous of everyone who might gain power over her husband, it boded ill for Geirlaug and Grethari. The faithful woman could not sleep for thinking about her charges, and her soul sank when a few months after the marriage, war broke out with a country across the seas, and the king rode away at the head of his troops. Then there happened what she had so long expected. One night when, unlike her usual habit, she was sleeping soundly. Afterwards she felt sure that a drug had been put into her food. The witch came to the tower. Exactly what she did there no one knew, but when the sun rose, the beds of Grithari and Geirlaug were empty. At dawn the queen summoned some of her guards and told them that she had been warned in a dream that some evil fate would befall her through a wild beast, and bade them go out and kill every animal within 2 miles of the palace. But the only beasts they found were 2 black foals of wondrous beauty, fitted for the king's riding. It seemed a pity to kill them, for what harm could 2 little foals do anyone? So they let them run away, frisking over the plain, and returned to the palace. "Did you see nothing? Really nothing?" asked the queen when they again appeared before her. "Nothing, your majesty," they replied. But the queen did not believe them, and when they were gone, she gave orders to her steward that at supper the guards should be well plied with strong drink, so that their tongues should be loosened, and further that he was to give heed to their babble, and report to her whatever they might let fall. "Your Majesty's commands have been obeyed," said the steward when, late in the evening, he begged admittance to the royal apartments. "But after all, the men have told you the truth. I listened to their talk from beginning to end, and nothing did they see save 2 black foals." He might have added more, but the look in the queen's blazing eyes terrified him, and bowing hastily, he backed quickly out of her presence. In a week's time the king came home, and right glad were all the courtiers to see him. "Now perhaps she will find someone else to scream at," whispered they amongst themselves. She was the queen, who had vented her rage on her attendants during these days, though what had happened to make her so angry nobody knew. But whatever might be the meaning of it, things would be sure to improve with the king to rule in the palace instead of his wife. Unfortunately, their joy only lasted a short while. For the very first night after the king's arrival, the queen related the evil dream she had dreamt in his absence, and begged him to go out the next morning and kill every living creature he saw within 2 miles of the city. The king, who always believed everything the queen said, promised to do as she wished. But before he had ridden through the lovely gardens that surrounded the palace, he was attracted by the singing of 2 little bluebirds perched on a scarlet-berried holly, which made him think of everything beautiful that he had ever heard of or imagined. Hour after hour passed by, and still the birds sang, and still the king listened, though of course he never guessed that it was Geirlaug and Grithari whose notes filled him with enchantment. At length darkness fell. The birds' voices were hushed, and the king awoke with a start to find that for that day his promise to the queen could not be kept. "Well, did you see anything?" she asked eagerly when the king entered her apartments. "Ah, my dear, I am almost ashamed to confess to you, But the fact is that before I rode as far as the western gate, the singing of two strange little bluebirds made me forget all else in the world. And you will hardly believe it, but not until it grew dark did I remember where I was and what I should have been doing. However, tomorrow nothing shall hinder me from fulfilling your desires. There will be no tomorrow, muttered the queen, as she turned away with a curious glitter in her eyes. But the king did not hear her. That night the king gave a great supper in the palace in honor of the victory he had gained over the enemy. The 3 men whom the queen had sent forth to slay the wild beasts held positions of trust in the household, for to them was committed the custody of the queen's person. And on the occasion of a feast their places were always next that of the king. So it was easy for the queen to scatter a slow but fatal poison in their cups without anyone being the wiser. Before dawn the palace was roused by the news that the king was dead, and that the 3 officers of the guards were dying also. Of course, nobody's cries and laments were as loud as those of the queen. But when once the splendid funeral was over, she gave out that she was going to shut herself up in a distant castle till the year of her mourning was over, and after appointing a regent of the kingdom, she set out attended only by a maid who knew all her secrets. Once she had left the palace, she quickly began to work her spells, to discover under what form Garlaug and Grithari lay hidden. Happily, the princess had studied magic under a former governess, so was able to fathom her stepmother's wicked plot, and hastily changed herself into a whale and her foster brother into its fin. Then the queen took the shape of a shark and gave chase. For several hours a fierce battle raged between the whale and the shark, and the sea around was red with blood. First one of the combatants got the better, and then the other. But at length it became plain to the crowd of little fishes gathered round to watch that the victory would be to the whale. And so it was. But when, after a mighty struggle, the shark floated dead and harmless on the surface of the water, the whale was so exhausted that she had only strength enough to drag her wounded body into a quiet little bay, and for 3 days she remained there as still and motionless as if she had been dead herself. At the end of the 3 days her wounds were healed, and she began to think what it was best to do. "Let us go back to your father's kingdom," she said to Grithari, when they had both resumed their proper shapes and were sitting on a high cliff above the sea. "How clever you are! I never should have thought of that," answered Grithari, who, in truth, was not clever at all. But Gerlaug took a small box of white powder from her dress, and sprinkled some over him and some over herself, and quicker than lightning they found themselves in the palace grounds from which Grithari had been carried off by the dragons so many years before. "Now take up the band with the golden letters and bind it about your forehead," said Garlaug, "and go boldly up to the castle. And remember, however great may be your thirst, you must drink nothing till you have first spoken to your father. If you do, ill will befall us both." "Why should I be thirsty?" replied Grithari, staring at her in astonishment. "It will not take me 5 minutes to reach the castle gate." Garlaug held her peace, but her eyes had in them a sad look. "Goodbye," she said at last, and she turned and kissed him. Grithari had spoken truly when he declared that he could easily get to the castle in 5 minutes. At least no one would have dreamed that it could possibly take any longer. Yet to his surprise, the door, which stood so widely open that he could see the color of the hangings within, never appeared to grow any nearer, while each moment the sun burned more hotly, and his tongue was parched with thirst. "I don't understand. What can be the matter with me, and why haven't I reached the castle long ago?" he murmured to himself as his knees began to knock under him with fatigue and his head to swim. For a few more paces he staggered on blindly, when suddenly the sound of rushing water smote upon his ears, and in a little wood that bordered the path he beheld a stream falling over a rock. At this sight his promise to Garlaug was forgotten. Fighting his way through the brambles that tore his clothes, he cast himself down beside the fountain, and seizing the golden cup that hung from a tree, he drank a deep draught. When he rose up, the remembrance of Geirlaug and of his past life had vanished, and instead something stirred dimly within him at the vision of the white-haired man and woman who stood in the open door with outstretched hands. "Grithari! Grithari! So you have come home at last!" cried they. For 3 hours Geirlaug waited in the spot where Grithari had left her, and then she began to understand what had happened. Her heart was heavy, but she soon made up her mind what to do, and pushing her way out of the wood, she skirted the high wall that enclosed the royal park and gardens, till she reached a small house where the forester lived with his 2 daughters. "Do you want a girl to sweep and to milk the cows?" asked she, when one of the sisters answered her knock. "Yes, we do, very badly. And as you look strong and clean, we will take you for a servant if you like to come," replied the young woman. "But first, what is your name?" "Laufrtha," said Geirlaug quickly, for she did not wish anyone to know who she was, and following her new mistress into the house, she begged to be taught her work without delay. And so clever was she that by and by it began to be noised abroad that the strange girl who had come to live in the forester's house had not her equal in the whole kingdom for skill as well as beauty. Thus the years slipped away, during which Garlaug grew to be a woman. Now and then she caught glimpses of Grithari as he rode out to hunt in the forest, but when she saw him coming she hid herself behind the great trees, for her heart was still sore at his forgetfulness. One day, however, when she was gathering herbs, he came upon her suddenly, before she had time to escape, though as she had stained her face and hands brown and covered her beautiful hair with a scarlet cap, he did not guess her to be his foster sister. "What is your name, pretty maiden?" asked he. "Laufrtha," answered the girl with a low courtesy. "Ah, it is you then of whom I have heard so much," said he. "You are too beautiful to spend your life serving the forester's daughters. Come with me to the palace, and my mother the queen will make you one of her ladies in waiting." "Truly, that would be a great fortune," replied the maiden, "and if you really mean it, I will go with you. But how shall I know that you are not jesting?" "Give me something to do for you, and I will do it, whatever it is," cried the young man eagerly. And she cast down her eyes and answered, "Go to the stable and bind the calf that is there, so that it shall not break loose in the night and wander away. For the forester and his daughters have treated me well, and I would not leave them with aught of my work still undone." So Grithari set out for the stable where the calf stood, and wound the rope about its horns. But when he had made it fast to the wall, he found that a coil of the rope had twisted itself round his wrist, and, pull as he might, he could not get free. All night he wriggled and struggled till he was half dead with fatigue. But when the sun rose, the rope suddenly fell away from him, and very angry with the maiden, he dragged himself back to the palace. "She is a witch," he muttered crossly to himself, "and I will have no more to do with her." And he flung himself on his bed and slept all day. Not long after this adventure, the king and queen sent their beloved son on an embassy to a neighboring country to seek a bride from amongst the 7 princesses. The most beautiful of all was, of course, the one chosen, and the young pair took ship without delay for the kingdom of the prince's parents. The wind was fair, and the vessel so swift that, in less time than could have been expected, the harbor nearest the castle was reached. A splendid carriage had been left in readiness close to the beach, but no horses were to be found, for everyone had been carried off to take part in a great review which the king was to hold that day in honor of his son's marriage. "I can't stay here all day," said the princess crossly when Grithari told her of the plight they were in. "I am perfectly worn out as it is, and you will have to find something to draw the carriage, if it is only a donkey. If you don't, I will sail back straight to my father." Poor Grithari was much troubled by the words of the princess. Not that he felt so very much in love with her, for during the voyage she had shown him several times how vain and bad-tempered she was. But as a prince and a bridegroom, he could not, of course, bear to think that any slight had been put upon her. So he hastily bade his attendants to go in search of some animal, and bring it at once to the place at which they were waiting. During the long pause the princess sat in the beautiful golden coach, her blue velvet mantle powdered with silver bees drawn closely round her, so that not even the tip of her nose could be seen. At length a girl appeared driving a young ox in front of her, followed by one of the prince's messengers, who was talking eagerly. "Will you lend me your ox, fair maiden?" asked Grithari, jumping up and going to meet them. "You shall fix your own price, and it shall be paid ungrudgingly, for never before was king's son in such a plight. My price is seats for me and my 2 friends behind you and your bride at the wedding feast," answered she, and to this Grithari joyfully consented. 6 horses would not have drawn the coach at the speed of this one ox. Trees and fields flew by so fast that the bride became quite giddy, and expected besides that they would be upset every moment. But in spite of her fears, nothing happened, and they drew up in safety at the door of the palace, to the great surprise of the king and queen. The marriage preparations were hurried on, and by the end of the week, everything was ready. It was perhaps fortunate that the princess was too busy with her clothes and her jewels during this period to pay much heed to Grithari, so that by the time the wedding day came round, he had almost forgotten how cross and rude she had been on the journey. The oldest men and women in the town agreed that nothing so splendid had ever been seen as the bridal procession to the great hall, where the banquet was to be held before the ceremony was celebrated in the palace. The princess was in high good humor, feeling that all eyes were upon her, and bowed and smiled right and left. Taking the prince's hand, she sailed proudly down the room, where the guests were already assembled, to her place at the head of the table by the side of the bridegroom. As she did so, 3 strange ladies in shining dresses of blue, green, and red glided in and seated themselves on a vacant bench immediately behind the young couple. The red lady was Gerlaug, who had brought with her the forester's daughters, and in one hand she held a wand of birch bark, and in the other a closed basket. Silently they sat as the feast proceeded. Hardly anyone noticed their presence, or if they did, supposed them to be attendants of their future queen. Suddenly, when the merriment was at its height, Gerlaug opened the basket, and out flew a cock and hen. To the astonishment of everyone, the birds circled about in front of the royal pair, the cock plucking the feathers out of the tail of the hen, who tried in vain to escape from him. "Will you treat me as badly as Grithari treated Gerlaug?" cried the hen at last. And Grithari heard, and started up wildly. In an instant all the past rushed back to him. The princess by his side was forgotten, and he only saw the face of the child with whom he had played long years ago. "Where is Gerlaug?" he exclaimed, looking round the hall, and his eyes fell upon the strange lady. With a smile she held out a ring which he had given her on her 12th birthday, when they were still children, without a thought of the future. "You and none other shall be my wife," he said, taking her hand and leading her into the middle of the company. It is not easy to describe the scene that followed. Of course, nobody understood what had occurred, and the king and queen imagined that their son had suddenly gone mad. As for the princess, her rage and fury were beyond belief. The guests left the hall as quickly as they could, so that the royal family might arrange their own affairs, and in the end it was settled that half the kingdom must be given to the despised princess, instead of a husband. She sailed back at once to her country, where she was soon betrothed to a young noble, whom in reality she liked much better than Grithari. That evening Grithari was married to Gerlaug, and they lived happily till they died, and made all their people happy also. And now as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.